Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is Concepts Lecture 30, Nationalism and Postnationalism. First, I'll talk a little bit about what a nation is, just in a very simple way, having to do with the fact that for many centuries there were no such thing as nations. So when contemporary discussions about post-nationalism are underway, sometimes it can be easy to forget that it's a relatively recent construct. And then the second half of this will be mostly an example of how post-nationalism as an idea works in the art world. So first, what is a nation? In surveys of world art history, in textbooks and courses, the first centuries or the first weeks of the course are usually occupied by conventional names for groups of people. And usually the names themselves, the names are not the ones that the people themselves used. For example, Inca is a Quechua language family meaning king. The Inca themselves called themselves Tawantinsuyu, meaning group of four Suyu, where Suyu means region. Tawa, four, Ntin, group, Suyu, region. It's conventional to make the name of the group into an adjective and then add a noun to describe the kind of the group, like this. The Inca, for example, usually referred to as the Inca civilization or the Inca Empire. But nothing like empire or civilization are implied by the word Tawantinsuyu. That's a map showing the Inca quote-unquote empire juxtaposed on modern nations. There's a couple really useful words here, exonym and endonym, that are borrowed from linguistics. An exonym is a name given by a group of people to another group, like Inca. This can be the name given to a group like a country. It can be the name given to an ethnic region or peoples. It can be a name given to a religion. Any name that's given by people who are not part of the group to another group. An endonym is the self-description, like Tawantinsuyu. Empire, as in Inca Empire, is also an exonym because Tawantinsuyu means group of four regions, not empire of four regions. The language family Quechua is also an exonym because Quechua speakers don't call their language Quechua, they call it Runasimi. And there are some locations of some of the currently spoken Quechuan languages in the Quechua language family. Early history is full of these pairs of exonyms. So for example, kingdom. It's conventional in English to talk about Egyptian kingdoms, the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and so on. There's the kingdom of Kush, farther down, farther south in Africa, the kingdom of Theodoric. There are Irish kingdoms, Kashmiri kingdoms, the kingdom of Aksum, the Georgian kingdom, the kingdom of Zimbabwe, all exonyms. The word empire is also very widely used. Sasanian Empire, Achaemenid Empire, in Persia, the Ottoman Empire, the Mongol Empire, and so on. Lots more, very common in history and in art history. The word dynasty is closer to an endonym because it translates a term, for example, in Chinese, Song, Yuan, and Ming dynasties in English. But there's also Korean ones, Goryeo, Silla, Joseon in Korea. Period is also really common. There's the Nara and Heian and Kamakura periods in Japan in English language usage. And culture, the Yoruba culture, a complex and interesting example because it's a language and a region and a set of beliefs. Chimu in Peru. And there are lots more. Sultanate, people, city-state, Rapa Nui, for example, people, and so on. These labels can be classified in different ways, and I have a couple screens on that. This is the first one. So first of all, a lot of them are just placeholders, which is another term for linguistics. They're generic or uninformative designations, just denoting a place of concentrated or coherent power, like empire, kingdom, sultanate, when they're used in that way. Also, these labels can be used as assessments of value. So civilization definitely confers value on the culture to which it's applied, and the word culture and the word people. And then, most important for art history, there are classifications of art and cultural practices. like period or style, but also culture and people as they're used in archaeology. A little bit more on civilization then. So a couple of common uses of civilization: the Inca civilization, the Maya civilization, Aztec, Harappan civilization in India and Pakistan, Minoan, Olmec, and so on. Civilization usually implies that there's writing, there are cities and monuments, that is, in pre-modern periods, large-scale stone architecture that survives and sculpture, the control of a substantial region, and also practical skills, agriculture, metallurgy, and so on. So note the biases in that definition. If you're going to have your culture be called a civilization in art history or history, it usually means that you have large-scale permanent architecture, you're geographically expansionist, and you had writing. There are about a half dozen conventionally named quote-unquote cradles of civilization, places where civilization superseded cultures or people and supposedly arose for the first time. So Olmec has been named this way for Mesoamerica, Norte Chico for Peru, Harappa, Egypt, Sumeria, and Erlitou, which is in China. In early 20th century scholarship, there was only one quote-unquote cradle of civilization. That was the ancient Near East. James Henry Breasted at University of Chicago was the one who coined the term Fertile Crescent in a book written in 1916. This Fertile Crescent quote-unquote cradle of civilization is parts of present-day Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, and parts of Iran. There are more recent attempts to claim cradles of civilization, and they're often much more clearly nationalistic. Just two examples of those. There's a book that they're illustrated on the left, In Search of the Cradle of Civilization from 1995, argues that the Harappan culture, the one that's in present-day India and Pakistan, and not Indo-European immigration, was the root of contemporary Indian culture as a way of asserting nationalist identity. The one on the right is published in Taiwan, translates as The Cradle of Civilization from 2001, has a really strange argument in it that the first seeds of human civilization in Asia were planted on a landmass known as Mudalu, which once stretched from Taiwan to Hawaii. So it's a what is it, a geological claim for the independence of Taiwan. Empire and kingdom also have political meanings. An empire, generally speaking, is a group of states or ethnicities, cities, city-states, and other forms of organization ruled by a central power or by one person. So the British Empire was a collection of nations, colonies, what they called protectorates, and other kinds of states, ruled for most of the 19th century by Queen Victoria. A kingdom is usually used to designate a more unified entity ruled by one person. So today the world is filled with nations, another label. And a concise definition of nation for the purpose that I have here as connecting with art history is a political unit that claims status as a cultural unit. Nation is the cultural unit, and it often overlaps national boundaries. Nation state is the ideal form in which the political boundaries coincide with the cultural boundaries. So this is what fills the world today, and I just want to show a couple of exceptions to it. First exception has to do with the Islamic State. In 1996, when the Taliban first ruled Afghanistan, they declared an Islamic emirate, which is partly compatible with the idea of nation, followed the borders of the nation at the time. In 2002, the name was Transitional Islamic State of Afghanistan, and in 2021, the Taliban promised to reinstate the Islamic Emirate. So ISIL proclaimed itself the current Islamic Caliphate, and that was not compatible with existing nations. It was recognized by some nations as a proto-state, which shows the hegemony of the idea of nation-state. You could have a proto-state, but eventually you would have to have a state. A completely different kind of exception to the rule of nations is talk about civilizations and cultures as units larger than individual nations. This is Samuel Huntington's book, Clash of Civilizations, which started as an article in 1993. and argued that future wars shouldn't be between countries, nations, or nation states, but between cultures and civilizations, especially civilizations, meaning the West and Islam, or the West and non Christian or non democratic nations. It's ironic that literature on civilizations and cultures of this sort tends to be nationalistic because people defend their own nation as an exemplar of a civilization or a culture, or the model, for example, of democracy as embodied by certain nations in particular. The third is, well, much less serious. Micronations are small groups, sometimes just families, sometimes individual people, who declare independence from the nation in which they're nominally existing. And often they're tolerated by the surrounding nation because they're small. There's a couple hundred of these, and there's a couple of really entertaining books like this one, which is a Lonely Planet travel guide to micronations because you can visit some of them. And in some cases, you can even get visas, and they sell stamps, postage stamps, and things like that. It's really entertaining, but it's also deeply symptomatic of the fact that the world has been divided up into nations. This is a map of potential new nation states in Europe that was drawn in 2014. So the person who drew this up just looked at all the sources that he could in order to determine where secession movements, if they were successful, might have created nations. And so some of them are well known, and have been politically active, um, and other ones are just have just been mentioned in passing. But this is what Europe would look like if it continued to divide into nation states, which of course has happened repeatedly in the past. So a little bit about how nations depend on culture. If nations and nation states are reasonably described as political units that claim status as cultural units, then everything depends on that word culture. There are three ways of thinking about culture in this respect. First of all, culture can be a set of objects and practices. That would be a language, the fashion, the music, the religion, the cuisine, and so on. And those are often imagined as being all connected to each other, forming a zeitgeist, a spirit of the age, or in this case, of the nation and the nation state. There's a separate concepts lecture on that. It's an idea that comes from Hegel. Culture can also be thought of as an assembly of feelings, values and attitudes, ideologies, conservative or liberal, and so on, beliefs. As Don Mitchell puts it, a quote, nebulous structure of feelings that define the life of a people. And so, in this second way of thinking, it's not the literal inventory of your language or your actual fashions or your music and the things like that, but it's the values that underlie them that create the sense of culture that supports the idea of the nation state. And then, third, culture can also be representations of the products of culture, the first thing on the list that mold people's feelings, the second one. And this idea of culture as a constellation of representations can be found very eloquently in Guy Debord. Following Marx, he thought no one has control or more than a partial understanding of these representations. We're all inside them, we're part of them, the network of representations, or as he called it, the spectacle of representations. It's often mentioned in the literature that nations need to continuously define themselves. Part of the activity is repeating this ideology of the identity between the political unit and the cultural unit. And that's the reason for the large amount of educational literature on this subject. You can get lots of graphics like this online. So this is a large and interesting subject, the self-representation of nation states and the insistence on or the interest in or the compulsion to continuously refine and repeat and rehearse ideas of culture so that they're synonymous with the political entity. I don't want to go any further into this here except to note that this is a dynamic that is repeated exactly in art historical accounts, especially when it comes to nation states, but even projected into the past as it pertains to quote unquote empires and kingdoms and the other categories. Our second category here is post-nationalism. The transnationalism and post-nationalism and non-nationalism, they're all different ways of emphasizing artistic and also economic and social and ethnic connections that cross or don't observe or hybridize or blend or blur or problematize national borders. Transnationalism in particular includes studies of diaspora and migration, and there are large literatures on both of those subjects, cultural hybridity, refugee movements, and decolonization, which is a subject of another video in this series. Post-nationalism and non-nationalism are the study of these artistic connections. So especially in relation to debates about globalization of the art market, post-nationalism has become a point of special interest because there are also interests in the local that animate and articulate the global art market, but interests in the diasporic and the migratory and the hybrid and the refugee experience and movements and decolonization counterbalance that, and often it constitute an implicit critique of it. So I'm just going to take as an example Yirrkala. It's an Aboriginal art center in the Northern Territory in Australia. The native population of that area, including the artists that are mostly represented at the art center, are Yolngu ethnic Aboriginals. In 2019, there was a workshop there on post-national art histories. There were a number of us international scholars there to think about post-nationalism, and specialists, art historians, and others from Australia. Ian McLean, who's a specialist in Aboriginal art, asked at this conference whether, quote, post-national art practices and histories decolonize national art practices and histories. In other words, can post-national ideas affect or effectively create a decolonization of national art practices? In this area around Yirrkala, most people speak Yolngu Matha languages, and these Australian art centers are run by the government, mostly white Australians, and studied by mostly white, and in this case also international scholars. So McLean is concerned that a post-national art history might misrepresent local practices, and we were interested in finding out about the relation between that and decolonizing. In another context, like for example in North America, the main question for that meeting might have been different. It might have been, how do we decolonize art history so that it can be attentive to Yolngu values and meanings? In the North American understanding, decolonizing Australian art history in relation to Aboriginal practices would involve giving Yolngu voices equal place in conferences and textbooks and curricula. Would have been quite a different project. In the Australian context, that wasn't really conceivable. That workshop had only 2 interpreters of Yolngu Matha languages. Even though the artists and spokespeople were there, the workshop proceeded on the tacit assumption that decolonization would come about by international or post-national participation. And in the several days of that workshop, decolonization was only mentioned briefly, once. The central artwork around which our conversations gathered was this, the Yirrkala church panels, as they're called, done in 1962 and 1963. They've been nominated as the most significant artworks in Australia. They're here in the photograph behind the central panel with the crosses and the 2 apparently blank panels on either side. They're the panels behind them. The minister at that time invited the clans in the area to paint something of their own for the church, and the result was these 2 church panels, which are the first representation of the Yolngu as a people, and they were also a pictorial gesture made against the Australian government's opening of the bauxite mine at that nearby town, Nhulunbuy. They've since been removed from the church, which is an open-air church, and they've been put in tsunami-proof cases across the street in the art center. The Australian art historian Terry Smith calls them, quote, a founding document in the Australian post-colonial national imaginary. On the largest planetary scale, they inform and should inspire the quest for post-national, coeval coexistence that is so urgently needed as geopolitical disunity increasingly fails to deal with the dangers of global warming. There's an excellent essay on them in eFlux, available online. So in order to decolonize art history in Australia in a North American sense, it would be necessary to have Yolngu people write about the panels and sing, which is part of their practice and perform and make more images like that. But because that kind of parody is not immediately feasible, the conversation at that event in 2019 was more about the idea of applying post-national art history, as in Ian McLean's question, to the nation's, quote, most significant art. So including the church panels with the history of Australian art rather than with Yolngu art. So the nation and the nation state are the only remaining viable internationally recognized forms for government and culture, even though they are continuously questioned by the mismatch between cultural and political identity in the nation and the nation state, and by the art world's interest in transnationalism, postnationalism, and decolonization. So it's entirely an open question how this discourse proceeds, but I think that it's useful to think about the deeper history of these labels, these exonyms, and of the nationalist ambitions embedded in these definitions of nation and nation state.